Coming up next on Primary Care, I sit down with leading cardiologist Dr. Barbara Hutchinson at the Healthy Church's 2020 National Conference in Charlotte to discuss the disease that kills one woman every minute. And later, I'm joined by Marsha Henderson of the Federal Drug Administration to talk about the agency's role in advancing women's health. Hello, and welcome to Primary Care. I'm your host, Dr. Lonnie Joe. Did you know that before the age of 50, African Americans' heart failure rate is 20 times higher than that of whites? 4 risk factors that strongly predict heart failure are high blood pressure, chronic kidney disease, being overweight, and having low levels of HDL, the good cholesterol. 75% of African Americans who develop heart failure have high blood pressure by the age of 40. Joining me to discuss these alarming statistics is Dr. Barbara Hutchinson. Dr. Hutchinson is president of the Association of Black Cardiologists and managing partner of the Chesapeake Cardiac Care. Dr. Hutchinson, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So glad to have you here. The president of the Association of Black Cardiologists, longtime organization that we hold in high esteem as practicing physicians in this country. Thank you for coming.
It's a pleasure to be here.
The deadly trio, or the deadly quartet, as we call it, high blood pressure, diabetes, kidney disease, and lipid disorders, affect this whole discussion of heart failure. Talk to us about the role that they play.
Absolutely. Heart failure in African Americans is predominantly due to the high burden of hypertension that we see in this population. And this is in contrast to Caucasians, where it tends to be more ischemic heart disease. But high blood pressure, as you know, it's what kills us all as African Americans. And the untreated high blood pressure, as you would imagine, would lead to other disease processes such as chronic kidney disease, diabetes, blindness, and other cardiovascular problems.
So they're all related.
They're absolutely related.
A little bit of a domino effect circulating
exactly.
there. How is this, the differences between men and women, how is this really portraying itself right now?
Well, in terms of the African Americans as a whole, as you pointed out, when we look at under the age of 50, we are almost 20 times more likely to end up with congestive heart failure because it presents earlier, and the lifetime risk for us is also much higher.
So we get all the sequelae related to untreated high blood pressure.
High blood pressure.
Which we need to emphasize, and well, like we have, continue to emphasize that blood pressure needs to be controlled no matter what the age group.
That's absolutely.
But women represent a little bit of a particular problem for us practicing physicians. You guys are special, of course, and we have missed the sequelae related to heart and heart disease in women. Which has been rising up in the literature recently.
Right. Well, you know, I think it goes back to the whole role of the woman. If you go back to the role of the woman in the home, she takes care of everybody else except herself. And I always like to say, if a woman is having chest pain, she probably has to call the babysitter, she has to call the vet, she has to call her mother, she has to call everybody before she actually goes to get help. And that's traditionally has been the problem. So by the time women present with disease, it's often far gone because they have ignored themselves.
Talk about the way that women can present sometime. I mean, it's different enough for us to pay attention.
It is, because sometimes when we think of heart disease or heart attack, we think of the typical chest pain. But women could have underlying heart problems with no chest pain. They may have other symptoms like shortness of breath, shoulder discomfort, abdominal discomfort. So it's a little atypical, and that's why sometimes they're missed or misdiagnosed, because we're not often thinking of those symptoms as predisposing to heart disease.
Mom is just tired.
That's right, because they also present with fatigue, excessive fatigue, and that again could point to heart disease.
So the heart attack. Talk to our audience a little bit about what people experience or what they can experience in the midst of having a heart attack or leading up to a heart attack?
Well, sometimes leading up to a heart attack, you can have several symptoms, and the symptoms may be related. As you know, heart attack is because the vessels that feed the heart become blocked, and those vessels are located in different areas, so it all depends on which vessels are involved. But some of the symptoms you could have is just marked fatigue, we talked about. You could be having nausea, you could have shortness of breath. But what I always like to say, any symptom that you have that it's worse with exertion and gets better with rest, you need to pay attention. I often recall someone having 9 neck surgeries because they thought the neck pain was related to a cervical problem. And it was not until I saw the patient and realized that it's always with exertion. Patient ended up having 4-way bypass surgery.
So we need to pay attention to symptoms no matter how small they may be as they present.
Absolutely.
Heart attacks can be a devastating thing. You've seen
many in my lifetime.
Lots of people who suffer from the next weeks and the next months and the next years of after having a heart attack. What can African Americans do to begin to prevent this deadly disease?
Well, I think the first thing is, like we said, be aware of the risk factors for heart disease. The number one, the one we like to stress is hypertension. There's diabetes, there's hypercholesterolemia, there's inactivity, move more. We need to be a little more physical. And the other thing too, like I talked about today, is the sleep disorders. Because obstructive sleep disorders can lead to other heart problems. So paying attention to these risk factors, number one. Number two, just knowing your numbers in these areas. If your blood pressure is high and you're already taking medication, it means it's inadequate. So you need to be more aggressive in saying, you know, I need to be on more medication. Similarly, your lipid, your cholesterol is elevated and you're already on medication, it needs to be adjusted. So there's a certain component here that involves the patient being their own advocate.
We're here at Healthy Churches 2020 and you addressed the audience this morning. Excellent presentation, by the way. What can the church do? What role does the church play in this whole healthy lifestyle? We love our churches. We love everything about our religious side of being Black and in America. But what role does the church play in today's society in helping people understand that there are health concerns that you need to address?
Sure. And I think the church sometimes may underestimate that their role may sometimes be even more important than my role, because patient would go to church sometimes before coming to see the doctor. And so since you have them as a captive audience, I think the first thing that the church could do is make sure they educate their members on some of these risk factors. The same things as we're sharing, they can start that in the church. And secondly, not just educate them on the risk factors, but actually enable them to live a healthy lifestyle. And so the food that is served in church should also be foods that will enable you to live a healthy lifestyle.
You're the president of the Association of Black Cardiologists. Tell us about ABC and what their role is in terms of helping us address heart disease in this country.
Sure. ABC, now 43 years old, has been working in this space for a long time, and the main thing is that we want to prevent heart disease and stroke. But in addition to that, we also want to eliminate some of the disparities that also exist in healthcare. And one of the things that recently we've been championing, as you know, all the medications and everything that we use have all been tested through clinical trials. And one of the problems is that there have not been many minorities enrolled in clinical trials, and that's where one area that we really have to eliminate that disparity, and so we're working aggressively in that area. We have 3 main pillars. One is educating communities, and also educating physicians about heart disease. In that space too, we also try to increase the workforce, because you need patients to have physicians that are of the same ethnic group. So we try to increase the number of minorities that's in the cardiovascular space. We also, along the lines of advocacy, advocating for patients and advocating for physicians. And then the third pillar is research. As I mentioned, the area that we are specifically targeting is increasing minorities that are enrolled enrolled in clinical trials.
Which is still a problem for us. We, a few years ago, just came through the tamoxifen and breast cancer trials that included so few African American females. There was no real determination on how the drug actually worked. Thus, the same thing in heart disease. We really need to emphasize that with patients and community as well as providers.
Yeah, but I think we first have to address what those barriers are and try to minimize the barriers, because one of the things for African American in clinical trial is the mistrust, and this is from history. And so they need to see more people like them in that space. So that means you need to have more African Americans that are clinical investigators, more African Americans that are also coordinators in these clinical trials. And those are two areas that we're also working in.
Very good. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a pleasure.
It's been my pleasure.
We've been talking with Dr. Barbara Hutchinson, the president of the Association of Black Cardiologists and managing partner of the Chesapeake Cardiac Care. Thank you for joining us. We'll do this again. When we return, we'll be joined by Assistant Commissioner for Women's Health at the FDA, Marsha Henderson. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Our bodies tell a story, each incredibly unique, shaped by family history, passed on from one generation to the next. Where you got your eyes, your laugh, the little crinkle in your nose, or maybe your risk for heart disease or stroke. As women, we must unite. Seek your history, know your risk, protect your future.
Welcome back. Many may not know that throughout its 100-year history, the Federal Drug Administration, or the FDA, has played a leading role in advancing women's health. My next guest is Marsha Henderson. Ms. Henderson is the Assistant Commissioner for Women's Health at the Food and Drug Administration and heads up women's health research and community education programs. Ms. Henderson, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for the invitation.
Marsha, a lot of people don't know the FDA. You'd be surprised how many folks know there's something out there like that, but then they may even identify with what the initials stand for. Tell us about this vast organization.
Well, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration is over 100 years old, as you've said. We're the oldest consumer protection agency in the federal government. We regulate about 25 cents of every dollar manufactured in this country. Everything from all foods except meat and poultry, all medications, both over-the-counter and prescription. We regulate tobacco. We regulate devices, medical devices, and biologics. And as we like to say, every morning when you wake up and you put on your eyeglasses, when you take your medicine, when you microwave your food, when you go out for a test or for a flu shot, when you feed your pet, you've been touched by the Food and Drug Administration. So, for example, this morning I went to a breakfast, and I would say that everyone there assumed they would be fine after they ate the meal, or when they go home this evening and prepare their dinner. The food that they got from the grocery, they will assume they will be healthy after having eaten it. And that isn't always what used to be the case, but now you take it for granted. But there are thousands of scientists and workers at the FDA who work every day to assure that safety and effectiveness of medical products and everyday food that's on the table.
So, your interest in women's health, how does the FDA actually carve out or include women's health as a issue that they want to address?
Well, you know, based on the things I've described, women are involved in all of this. Our office, for example, is responsible for looking at sex differences, things that are different for women than for men when they use medical products. We also are interested in conditions that disproportionately affect women, whether it's pregnancy or menopause or even things like depression and Alzheimer's disease. So one of the things that we do is we really focus a lot on clinical trials. FDA is an agency that regulates these products. We do not conduct trials. We receive applications for products, and we regulate whether they can go onto the market to the general public.
Our group has done several clinical trials over the years, and I've seen the value of African Americans participating in clinical trials. Let me give you an example. Our first clinical trial years ago was on a hypertensive drug. At the time, the control of high blood pressure amongst African Americans in this country was 27%. We're now at about 54, 55% on an average, okay? And that was because the ability to safely and properly conduct clinical trials and include populations of people in them that needed to be in them. But this has not gone over well in the African American community for a lot of reasons. And we always revert back to the Tuskegee incident, which I think is long over in terms of our thinking at least. So what is the FDA doing to promote clinical trials, especially amongst women?
Well, we're doing a range of things. We realize that we have, one, regulatory requirements that our manufacturers have to adhere to. We put together the guidance. As I said, we don't conduct trials. We're not NIH. We don't conduct trials. But we receive applications, and we have rules around what should happen. One of the things is that we have informed consent requirements so that when people are recruited into clinical trials, they have better protections than they used to have. I know a lot about what you're referring to. My husband often says, "I remember Tuskegee." And I say, "No, you don't. You were not around. You do not remember Tuskegee." And we know that we're going to take the products. So if you're going to take the product, it's best to be in it in the front end so we can be assured that it works as effectively on us as it may on others.
Do these clinical trials always include taking medications, or are there other areas like the informed consent that you were talking about?
FDA is doing a variety of things related to clinical trials. One is we have procedures and requirements. One of those is we expect that manufacturers will include what we call the end user in the trials. We want people in the trials that look like those that will be taking the product. So, for example, we also have ways to protect those people, and those protections have now been much better defined than they were in the days when Tuskegee, that experiment. We have what the Office of Women's Health is doing. We have a three-prong initiative. One is focusing on women themselves. We're going out, for example, at this conference where I'm here in Charlotte this week, focusing on churches, because we know that the church has a powerful voice as it relates to their parishioners and including them in discussions about how they can better their health. So we want the church to really talk to their parishioners about why it's important to be in a clinical trial. We also are doing things with the actual manufacturers to encourage them to have protocols that will look very seriously at assuring that those end users are in the trials. And the third thing that we're doing is we're educating health professionals to alert them that there need to be more people of color and women in clinical trials. We're also looking at specific disease areas where we need higher numbers, such as cancer, Alzheimer's, autoimmune conditions, diabetes, depression. We would like to have higher numbers, more diverse numbers in those areas.
What questions should women or patients in general ask when they're approached about being a part of a clinical trial?
Well, the first question is, what is the trial about? What is this you're asking me to join? You also need to ask yourself, is this something for me? How will I benefit? Will it benefit me personally? Will it benefit others? You need to ask questions like, will I be taking a product, or will I simply be followed? I'm in a clinical trial. I have glaucoma. And I was one of those people who the drops didn't work for. And so I had a surgical procedure, which I was going to have anyway. And after I had that procedure, the doctor said, would you be in a clinical trial? And I think he thought I was automatically going to say yes, because of what I do for a living. And I said, no, I think you need to tell me a little more. And after he did, I was very clear that I thought it would be good, because all that was going to happen to me in this case was I was going to be followed. They wanted to see whether I did well, and it would also help other people, and often women in particular are interested not only in their care, but in helping others.
So we collect a lot of data through clinical trials, but also the people who interpret the data can have inherent biases in terms of what they bring to the table. I had a patient ask me once, approached about being in a clinical trial, who's on the board? And I thought it was very interesting, because they leaped over all of the user and customary responses to say, listen, who's going to use this information and assess it and come up with a statement that says this is good or bad? As you know, there are several medications we probably never have used and expected the outcomes in African Americans, okay? So people are beginning to get more intuitive to this. Do we see that as a place that we'll arrive at in the future in terms of being able to say, listen, we need to have the right kinds of eyeballs on this type of data in order to get the best response here?
We've become much more transparent. We're evolving, the science is evolving, and so is the public's expectation. Your patient is a classic example of the kind of questions we're getting. So we now have made a huge change at FDA. We have something called drug trial snapshots. Every drug, every new molecular entity, as we call it, that gets approved by FDA in the drug space is now posted every month. The new ones are posted. We show you who's in the clinical trial, what was learned, what the side effects are, if there are any differences by race or by age or by sex. That is posted publicly. You can go on a website and take a look at that. So I think that that will also be very helpful.
What about the provider? Do we play a special role? I know we play a role. Should we be enhancing it? Should we go for more training in some instances to actually be a better steward of the whole clinical trial process?
Well, we're doing two things. One, of course, the answer is yes at all phases. The healthcare provider is the conduit to the clinical trials. And one of the things we're finding is people aren't being asked to enter a study. And so we make assumptions like, oh, they won't say yes because they know about Tuskegee. So they don't get asked. So some of our research indicates that there are many people who would participate, but they're not being asked. The second thing is that some professionals, health professionals, whether they are direct providers or whether they're researchers, don't know how to interpret data using newer techniques and methods. And so we're doing a lot of training, we're doing webinars, we're going to national associations to bring them up to date with the latest approaches to analyzing the data.
Marsha, you launched a new program this year, Diverse Women in Clinical Trials. Tell us about that.
Well, this initiative really focuses on trying to increase the numbers in the data sets that we receive for these medications and medical devices. One of the things that we're doing is that we're focusing on diversity a little differently than many expect. It's not just race or ethnicity. We're also focusing on encouraging women and older people and people with chronic conditions to enter clinical trials. Because as I said before, we want the end user. We are looking for the populations that are the end users. And typically, we're 50% of the population is women. We have many older patients that are using multiple drugs. So these populations that enter the trials should reflect those that will be using it at the end of the process. One of the things that we're doing is we're going to churches, we're going to various communities, asking them to talk to their members, to their parishioners, to encourage them to say yes when someone says, will you consider being in a study? As someone said to me, well, that's simple, we're going to use it anyway. So if we're going to use the product, we should be part of the process. It also will be treatment for some people. Many people have conditions for which we don't have really effective treatments right now. And so this will be an opportunity for them to have life-saving opportunities that they wouldn't have if they weren't in a clinical trial.
There's another program, it's been around for a little bit, the Pink Ribbon Program. Tell us about that also.
Well, as I indicated, FDA regulates many products, and many people don't know that we regulate mammography services. We do it typically through state and local health departments, but we have a responsibility to assure that the mammography equipment is standardized, as well as the people that operate it have standards that they have to adhere to. And we want African American women particularly to take advantage of the quality of the diagnosis that comes through mammography. As we know that we have very high mortality rates from breast cancer, but the good news is we have many more survivors. Everybody now knows that we have breast cancer survivors, and to a great extent some of that has come from early detection using high quality mammography. Churches have been very involved in the process, so we have a guide that we make available for free to churches to say to them, this is information from other churches around the country that tell you how you can engage in getting women to go for mammography. In addition to that guide, we have many products, about 45 products for consumers, talking about everything from HIV to diabetes, heart disease, even cosmetics and tattoos. And it's all free, and we ship for free. And so if you go to our website, your church or your organization, your sorority, your club, you can order it and we will ship it to you for free.
All the information, all the literature you can
Absolutely.
dream of. Yes, good. Thank you so much for being with us, Marsha. It's been our pleasure.
I appreciate it.
Thank you. My guest has been Marsha Henderson, Assistant Commissioner for Women's Health at the Food and Drug Administration. For Primary Care, I'm Dr. Lonnie Joe. You can get more information about the show and our guests at primarycare-tv.com and continue the conversation on Facebook and Twitter.